Okay, welcome everyone to our live stream about Are We Securing the Wrong Layer? Today I have with me Michael Lewellen from Turnkey. And Michael, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
All right. Thanks for having me here, Seth. So my name's Michael Lewellen. I've been working in the crypto space for a little over 12 years now. Originally, before this, was working at Open Zeppelin, focused on smart contract security, doing a lot of work on major protocols like Compound, Uniswap, Aave. And then since then, I've left and went to Turnkey, doing key management, kind of focusing on off-chain security, the sort of security layer that we've cared about ever since Mt. Gox and other exchanges were hacked way, way back in the day. Definitely excited to talk more about how we're seeing that becoming really the new attack surface in crypto.
All right, thank you, Michael. And just by way of introduction, my name is Seth Hallem. I'm the CEO here at Certora. My background is in originally static analysis tools for reliability and security. I founded a company called Coverity way back when. And then more recently in traditional cybersecurity, and now I've been in the crypto space for only about a year. So I'm a bit new, but getting my feet under me as we go through the year, and certainly learning that this is an interesting place to be as a cybersecurity professional and exciting in probably all the wrong ways. So maybe we can just start off with some of that excitement and just, starting with you, Michael. What's been going on lately and what's really caught your attention in the recent round of crazy hacks that we've seen?
Oh man, I mean, April has been a crazy month. Just looking back, I mean, we kicked off the month on April 1st with the Drift protocol hack, which was a $285 million hack on Solana, where we had DPRK targeting a multi-sig. That was notable for multiple reasons, and we can get into those. But generally, just the fact that it was such a large amount, that it was a very sophisticated, in terms of like kind of social engineering attack. And then following that, we've had several. I would say a spike in the number of hacks in general, and then KelpDAO was another notable one that came on April 18th. Another 292 million. We're still dealing with the ramifications of that on lending protocols and making up for the shortfall through Aave's recovery efforts and fundraising efforts. Also forced the Arbitrum Security Council, of which I'm a part, to freeze funds. And then finally, recently, we've also seen kind of SUI experience a lot more activity. Like I think 5 protocols in the last few days have been compromised. And then even recently, like this morning, I was literally looking at like the news, and I think what was this protocol? Wasabi apparently had a centralized key or admin role that was compromised, and led to a little over 5 million being lost across multiple chains. So we're just seeing a clear uptick in the amount of hacks, and like the majority of these hacks being focused on usually off-chain attack surface, not smart contracts.
And I agree with you, and obviously see the same thing. And I think, to me, the most notable thing that I think is a wake up call to all of us, I believe, is that if you look at some of these hacks, particularly Drift and Kelp, not only is the amount of funds stolen significant, but the level of sophistication is incredible. I mean, I think um, when I first came into the industry, I thought we've seen this kind of wave of smart contract hacks, but the advanced persistent threat and that kind of threat actor really hasn't reached the industry yet. But that certainly seems to have changed. So, what do you think is the reason for that? Do you think it's smart contracts getting better, or is it just attackers upping their game, or where's this coming from?
That's a great question. I think it's a mix. I definitely think we've had waves of smart contract hacks back in the day, especially back during DeFi summer. There was a lot of exploits happening, and I definitely think that we have seen a hardening. Like smart contract audits are now considered to be a pretty common standard, whereas before they were maybe more of a nice to have. It's now at a point where like no serious protocol usually can expect to see large TVL unless they have some public audits from reputable firms they can reference. And that's been a big help. It's not a silver bullet, but it absolutely has, I think, decreased the ease with which one can find a smart contract vulnerability. Um, I think combining that and the fact that a lot of attackers, especially DPRK, who's clearly been had their fingerprints on most of the biggest hacks we've seen, they've realized that like it's much easier to try to find a needle in a haystack, or to avoid going through the problems of like trying to find maybe a smart contract exploit that's been lost, as opposed to, hey, if they can see that there's a multi-sig or there are other centralized components within the protocol or key points of failures where they know that if they can compromise those computers, they absolutely could potentially like rug the whole protocol, and that's what they've done. Starting with Bybit over a year ago, and now more recently with Drift and Kelp DAO and others, and just realizing that's a clear point of failure. And on the flip side, I think things like AI, using Claude and other things that can write out complicated exploits, or at least help with like doing information gathering or targeting. I think that has made hacks more frequent and more focused on the OPSEC layer, because it just has made it much more economical to do what might otherwise be fairly sophisticated attacks. So I think both DPRK being a nation state actor and having lots of resources at their disposal, including in-person proxies that can engage with teams and try to build trust in order to exploit them. And then on the flip side, the fact that like even for non-DPRK actors, like the resources available to them to find exploits, to exploit them in sophisticated ways, is just much more accessible than it ever has been. And that definitely, I think this is kind of like a combination of factors that is creating a perfect storm for off-chain key management, or any sort of just like operational bottlenecks in crypto protocols are now just being like the number one target.
Makes sense, and I agree with you. I think we'll come back a little bit to the AI question and how that impacts smart contracts, even coming back around to that question, because I think there's something both alarming and interesting going on there. But sticking with the off-chain piece, if we look at the recent hacks, we've seen a few different patterns deployed, all of which are replicable and interesting. And I'm curious to know your thoughts about which ones are going to come back more and more often. So if we look at Drift, for example, we have really an attack that starts with social engineering. I mean, to the point that you have individuals meeting at conferences, building a relationship, a long grooming of a fake token to supply as collateral into a market, then a compromised multi-sig and sort of a social engineering attack vector to convince signers to approve it. So that's one, very social oriented attack vector. And then if you look at Kelp DAO, the attack vector is much more of a kind of typical APT style threat, where they embed themselves into a server, kind of patiently swap out a binary on servers that don't have any kind of signature protection on binaries. They were clever in making sure that it was undetectable, and they waited for the right moment to launch the attack when, that compromised binary might have been latent for who knows how long. If you had to put your finger to the wind, which of these is coming harder? And, on the flip side, if you're on the protocol side, which one should you be worried about most?
That's a tough one. I think they're both at a point where I fear them rather equally, but if I had to divvy them up and think about them differently, and the way protocol teams should think about them differently, I think the social engineering one is it's going to be more pernicious, and it definitely puts the onus on every employee that touches anything sensitive at a company. And that might not just be engineers, that could be people handling ops, that could be people handling finance, even people in social media or marketing, because these are potentially large avenues. We still occasionally have a Twitter hack where someone uses that to put out drainer links. But like if I honed in on like just people that touch sensitive operations in a crypto protocol or deploying code or things like that, I would say just the fact that like you can't trust anything you download. Supply chain attacks, of course, have always been common, but now this is coupled with a very sophisticated potential actor in DPRK and others that I'm sure will try to replicate it, to say like they're willing to engage with someone that is going to meet with you in person, that's going to build trust, that's going to put you off of your guard. And I think we have to be a little bit humble as humans and recognize that could happen to anyone. It could happen to me. I hope it's a high bar, maybe compared to the average person, and that I would have like warning signs in my head that would go off. Um, but I think in those cases, it's going to be a case of like now, with people being targeted and singled out, anything that they send you that you might open or access on your computer is now a potential attack vector. And we could get a little bit into the mitigations there, but I think that needs to be recognized as something that like everyone is susceptible to, and you have to start with like training, education, and then of course like some sort of endpoint protections that we can go into in more detail later. But it's definitely coming. And then on the flip side, in terms of like people getting in to systems and then being able to like lay in wait and then compromise the operations of a system at some key point through deploying malicious binaries and things like that, That's always been a problem, but I do think that like now we're seeing threat actors get a bit more sophisticated. Instead of trying to compromise the keys in this particular example, they compromised the RPC nodes that are being used to feed in data for it to make decisions on when funds get released, which is how like the large mint happened with KelpDAO. So in those cases, like it's definitely going to require like network hardening, but also like understanding what are all the weak points in your system. Obviously, people should care about hardening their keys. I work at Turnkey because we care a lot about key management. But at the end of the day, like even if the private key corresponding to that wallet is protected, the API key that's going to then tell that private key what to sign or tell that wallet solution what to sign um, is still susceptible to being lied to, such as the information from an RPC node that would tell it when it's appropriate to release funds to another actor or something like that. And so I think what we're seeing is that like the attack surface is spreading out from not just like the most sensitive parts of the system, but all the parts of the system that feed into it. And again, these are always attack vectors that exist, but I think we're now seeing actors become sophisticated enough to compromise that and to leverage it and to like understand more about how people's complex systems work in such a way that okay, it's becoming very clear that there are many unanticipated ways that people could compromise the system, which means that like you really have to think through a threat modeling exercise of what are all the downstream things that we trust when our systems are making automated decisions on when to release funds or do anything sensitive. So I think it's clear the attack surface is spreading out, and that if you harden the thing that's most important, they'll go for the second most important thing that could be still able to compromise a larger amount of funds.
I think you bring up many good points and I have many follow-on questions about it. But I think one of the things that strikes me, and we can make the same comment about the smart contract world, but first with the off-chain world, I think one of the ways that AI can be used, and that we use it, in our auditing business for good, is it's a great way to get a quick threat model of a protocol. And AI has become good enough that it's able to pull information from code, documentation, and other sources to figure out exactly what that threat model looks like. And it gives attackers, just like it gives defenders, a very quick way to assess where to go. And to me, that's a lot of what's changed. It's that the pace of triage has become so fast because I can ask Claude to look at a protocol that has significant TVL and say, look, where are the single points of failure? Where are the points of centralization? And it will actually answer that question for me quite accurately. And I think you're seeing the bad guys use that to great effect. And I think it's just, sort of feeding into my question. One of the things that struck me when I first came into this industry is that you have very small companies, 10 to 15 person companies, managing hundreds of millions of dollars in assets under management or TVL. And for a company that size, it's very hard to account for the full threat model of a complex protocol that has an on-chain piece, an off-chain piece, endpoints involved. Do you think this starts to change the industry in essence by basically saying, if you don't have the scale to have a significant and serious enterprise security practice, you're going to be compromised and therefore you can't survive? What do you think?
I think it's definitely a realization that is hitting home harder than it ever has. I think this was, we saw isolated cases, maybe not isolated, but like it has happened in the past. I think what we're now seeing is that rather than just being lucky or, not being the most targeted protocol, I think it's becoming clear that like attackers can now work down the list of any crypto project and eventually do analysis. And if you have any significant TVL, like you'll be a target. I think maybe the threshold for sophisticated attacks on protocols has gone down, like where maybe, only if you had 500 million or a billion would someone be able to put in the resources that, like, for example, were put into Bybit. I think now it's like, well, maybe if you only have like, 10 million or so, but they know they could get it through a particular sort of compromise that, there's someone out there willing to do that because it's just much more economical to do so. That's like one general way. And then, I think just if you had to think about like the average team, I think it's becoming clear that teams need to figure out how to, like, what do they truly need to own internally from a security perspective? Usually in the case of crypto and blockchains, that is the smart contract code. And obviously there's lots of budget that go to smart contract audits and securing it, but the on-chain operations, and obviously I'm a little biased here, But like if you're doing anything around key management or even the logic that handles those keys or decides when privileged actions are taken on chain, those are things you really need to harden. And a lot of teams might start out with something like, oh, we'll use a safe wallet with a couple ledgers. Um, Obviously, in the case of Bybit, that is, a point of failure that could be compromised, even if the keys on the ledger devices themselves are not exposed. Um, but I think also in automated systems, like having an API key that has access to do automation. We at Turnkey try to encourage teams to use our key management software specifically because you do have access to enterprise grade security that can essentially scope down these keys to only specific actions to really limit the exposure. But even then, you need to know how to take advantage of it. You need to know how to scope out these policies in a way that is very security conscious. So it definitely requires having either very security conscious team members or just a dedicated security person who is there to ensure that the threat model is always thought about whenever new code or new features or anything is being changed or deployed. Um, and it's often a race to try to improve your security over time as you scale as a company. And I think now, where teams could take their time getting to that point, now it's very clear that like very early on in your journey as a crypto protocol or anything that has TVL or funds that you're protecting, you need to be scaling your security far faster than people might have felt they could get away with in the past, and that includes finding good security professionals to rely on, but knowing that you have likely limited budget and knowing that like there are certain things that protocols should avoid doing in terms of there's obviously a lot of discussion around maybe protocols should avoid designing these point of failures in the first place, or relying on companies that have enterprise grade security that can take on these operations for them. There's a lot of ways that could be done depending on what kind of protocol you're building, but I think it's very clear. And as much as I don't like to say teams should outsource things that are crucial to their protocol, if you as a protocol or a team managing a protocol cannot like truly own that security model, you don't have the resources, you don't have the expertise, whatever it is, then it's kind of incumbent on you to say like, should we do this, or should we design this in a way where we're not a point of failure, or should we find external actors that can come in to help manage these operations that do have the enterprise grade security necessary to actually stand up to DPRK? And DPRK is a very scary opponent, and the fact that like a small startup is now the one that has to think about how do we stand up against a nation state actor is no joke, and it's definitely going to require teams to think about their security differently, not just in terms of what needs to be done, but how do they get the resources to do it when they're usually like you said, small teams early on.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the things that's always a tough balance, especially in our industry, is that the ethos of decentralization is valuable and it does make sense from a security perspective. But on the flip side, when you look at what's happened in other industries, and coming from my last job to here, I'm selling to law firms, and initially law firms were absolutely paranoid about moving anything to the cloud on the theory that, look, Microsoft and Google are now the biggest targets in the world, and and AWS, and everyone's going to go after them. But quickly you realize that the scale of investment needed to keep yourself safe is so large that in a way, economies of scale and centralization are the only possible solution. And so, sort of to your point, I think there has to be some recognition that yes, we believe in decentralization, but at the same time, we also believe in enterprise grade security.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, we can't always rely on a large decentralized network because it takes scale and cost in order to be able to secure a system to the degree needed to protect against DPRK. And so, much like we've seen with the cloud, that kind of centralized ability to protect yourself is necessary, even though it's not exactly decentralization. I mean, it's just, in a way, you can't win there. So putting yourself in the shoes of a protocol team, you mentioned a few things that you would do first, but maybe just to kind of distill that, if you're sitting there hearing this and thinking, my God, I haven't thought much about my off-chain infrastructure. I blew my entire security budget on smart contract audits. My multi-sig is a 2 out of 8 on ledger devices. Like, where do I start? What's my first top 3 things to do before I get completely drained here?
Oh boy. First, I would raise the threshold probably, because since you call that out explicitly. If and I know there's always an operational reason. I'd probably think about that because that obviously one, it's usually public. Like usually someone can look up your protocol, they can look up the number of signers you have in your safe. Like an attacker can immediately single that out. And if like this is the way I'd approach it. You could either do it through on-chain controls or off-chain through a key management solution like Turnkey. But I would set it up in such a way that, okay, if there's 2 out of 8 there, like I would ask why are we on 2 out of 8? If it's because of like operational expediency, like we can't wait for more than 2 signers to show up and sign things because we're using this on a regular basis. I would try to break out what are the sensitive actions that we could give to a smaller signing set that are not going to have as massive ramifications. So for example, if it's like, okay, they're doing minting and burning, that is very sensitive, but you can put restrictions on that. You can put you can only mint and burn this much over a short period of time, knowing that this is likely the amount that you would ever need to do. You can find ways to segregate that and maybe give it to a separate set of users, that's maybe a 2 out of 3 or something like that you feel comfortable with. And then I would still try to, if this is a default admin, that's to say this is the admin that controls everything or could control everything on the protocol that is privileged. I would definitely try to raise that threshold to like a 5 of 8 or a 6 of 9 or something like that. That's like definitely a higher quorum set. And then generally that is only used whenever you're setting policies for other operational roles that, again, that could do things like, deploying new contracts or things like that. So generally speaking, try to figure out like how to operationalize. Like with Turnkey, we try to tell people, hey, you can use policies that will essentially allow you to give very fine-grained controls to certain users, certain API keys. You can also encourage users to use things like YubiKeys keys that have very strong security properties, maybe a little bit more supported than Ledger devices. Although, funny enough, you can actually use your Ledger device as a YubiKey key. I learned that a month or 2 ago. But yeah, like use hardware-based security that's like effectively unphishable for sure on all of these. Whether that's like a device that custodies the key itself or something that's used to access the key in a key management solution like Turnkey. So that's my first big Turnkey plug. Just harden any sort of like on-chain controls as much as possible. Beyond that, then you're thinking, okay, what are these users using to sign things that are privileged? And then I would look at like, okay, what is your endpoint security practice? So many teams out there don't have endpoint security practices. They don't have EDR systems. They have no visibility into what happens on their employees' devices. Some employees might not even have a company device. They might be using their personal device. That's the next place I would go if saying like, let's get people onto company devices where everyone's using ideally something like the same setup. So your security team isn't trying to deal with too many different like operating systems at once. Get them on an EDR software that is going to be able to or fleet management that's going to be able to like make sure that they're following good security practices. Their devices lock frequently. They're updating common software. There's certain software they can't install just directly from the internet through a random link. Do whatever you can to harden it. Obviously, you have to balance that with like not wanting to, hurt productivity, and that is always like the balancing act. But definitely needing to at least start to roll things out on a frequent basis to harden more and more. And then also using software that is then going to feed logs back into some sort of SIEM system or something that's doing logging. And I think the biggest challenge there is like, okay, well, who's reading the logs? Who's trying to detect things? AI can do some of that, but someone also has to review what the AI is reporting back. So if you don't have a SOC, likely if you're a small startup, you don't have like a security operations center. There are solutions out there that are managed that are, and some of them. And I'm honestly, unfortunately, not super experienced with them personally, but I've seen the pricing for some of them, and they're like, $20 or $30 a month per device. They're not that expensive, actually, at least for things that would provide the bare minimum and come with like a managed aspect where there is a team that would be reviewing this for you and raising things. And that goes a long way to making sure that there isn't something laying in wait on these endpoint devices. And then from there, of course, if you have servers and if you have websites and other things that you're putting out there, making sure that like everything you're using, Cloudflare, cloud accounts, Vercel, GitHub, all of these things have 2FA enabled. They have hardened credentials, ideally also using YubiKeys keys wherever it's something highly sensitive. And ensuring that you have them locked down. You have logging that's also being forwarded to SIEM. So that you're aware if you're able to, again, look back and see where a compromise started. The fact that some of these hacks we've seen, at least based on the information we've heard so far, like because they didn't have logging enabled, they don't know how far back the like exploit even happened. They might be able to eventually tie it back to, oh, it looks like it was this link that was clicked on or something like that. But it can take a long time if you don't have a log of that system, whether it's endpoint devices, servers, privileged accounts. to know like when did this compromise happen, like that, because that's the most important thing to know when you're trying to contain the blast radius is like where did this happen, what could have been exposed. So just having like that information available, even if you're not maybe able to catch the incident, ideally you do, but in your response to the incident, it also gives you way more to work with. Even if you don't even have a security team that's capable of using those logs, if you bring in an external party, as soon as that attack happens, or you're just doing a regular audit, or you're doing something where external party needs information and context to know where weak points are, like the logs make a big difference.
Yeah, agreed. And I guess starting with my own plug for Certora, I mean, as a security provider, we view it as part of our role to come in and work with our clients on a comprehensive threat model. And we would say start there. You need to know what your risks are and where they lie. And then it's a matter of figuring out how you can design business processes that align with risk. And I think that's a lot of what we were talking about at the beginning, where we see protocol teams just saying, okay, I'm going to have one admin function on my contract, and that admin function can do everything. It's like that doesn't make any sense because some things have to happen to keep the business going, and there are operational things that happen day to day and have fast turnaround, but an upgrade is not. And there's no reason why those should be under the same control, the same people, the same multi-sig. You have to match up who's going to be making that decision, why, and on what timeline to the way you implement that on chain. And that's always where we start. And then we start to look at what's the potential risk of any of these things, assuming that they can happen. And so we would look at, for example, your supply chain and look at GitHub keys and say, okay, what's the potential risk of a supply chain compromise? Because we know that's an active area of attack. What's the potential risk of a compromise of a developer laptop, of an executive laptop, of a particular piece of server infrastructure, of a domain takeover? And let's try to figure out, based on potential impact, how to prioritize, because there's so much to be done. But I think the lesson that we're all learning, and bringing in CalFi as another example, is that when there is a single point of failure, and in CalFi's case, it was a domain with no transfer restrictions, somebody's going to find it, and they're going to take it, they're going to exploit it, and if you haven't gotten ahead of that, it's just something waiting to happen. So I think the challenge for teams is really to embrace the exercise and to say security is something where if all boats don't rise together, you're going to get sunk. And it's kind of a frustrating thing in that sense. You can feel very committed to security and be sure that you really care about it. But if you forgot one thing, that's the thing the attackers will find. And I guess that's what keeps security providers like us in business. But at the same time, that's what makes it a very frustrating thing for protocol teams to deal with. So we've talked a lot about the role of AI here, and I think you make very good points about AI accelerating the exploitability, and we talked about AI accelerating the discovery. What are some other ways that you think that AI is changing the landscape and really forcing a rethink of how the entire kind of security threat is perceived and addressed in protocol teams?
I've referenced this a bit, but I'll definitely reiterate, like, I think just the biggest impact of AI on security is that it has made the ability to find exploits and just like gather tons of context in a system and find exploits that are informed by that context much easier. And we talked a lot about how that has made it very easy for attackers to figure out how to compromise complex systems, especially can use a lot of data that's public, but also be able to, like, once you get access to someone's system, just like read-only access, through that, you could potentially find other ways to compromise it now that you have like an inside look. So it definitely makes information more powerful. On the flip side, however, I think it's also important to emphasize that this also gives a lot of options for defenders, because now, whereas before only manual analysis or very specific sort of tooling could figure out where exploits might lie and from a defensive posture, now AI can greatly accelerate that. So this same power that is being used by attackers is also available to defenders, both security teams, security vendors, and just maybe even individuals who just want to do security passes on their software. Now, AI is not foolproof. It's not going to necessarily catch all bugs, but it can certainly, do a lot of cleanup and harden a system to some degree, as long as the person using that AI tool can tell, a good finding from a bad one. And we also live in a world where there are lots of kind of skills files and things that security professionals are putting out that helps to accelerate the use of these AI tools to understand how to find exploits and triage, and even using AI agents against, or using them to kind of like play off one another to validate findings and kind of improve the quality of what actually gets reported to a team and how to fix it, and even also help with the fixing and help to write patches as well, which obviously still probably need a manual review. They still need a human to own the change to code. I think that's a principle every team should have, is that like a human is still responsible for the code deployed, even if an AI wrote a lot of it. But I do think that is the big impact. And like I've obviously seen lots of security teams, Certora, as among others, like in figuring out how to use AI as vendors to give clients the best value. Because obviously the biggest question then is, if a client can access Claude, what can security vendors do? And usually it is, providing insights that even Claude doesn't necessarily always capture, to really magnify the impact that it can have as a tool. So I think that's the good news, is like, both attackers and defenders have access to this power, and it's really incumbent upon defenders to get ahead of it and make sure that like it's not going to be leveraged. The AI is not going to be leveraged by attackers against them before they're able to, use it to harden themselves in response. And then figuring out how to do so in the most responsible way. Don't just let AI report a bunch of bugs to exhaust your team. Make sure that they're high quality, and then on the flip side, making sure that when you're patching it, you're not introducing other bugs that the AI might accidentally add in. So we can use AI a lot, but we should still trust humans to get the final fix in.
So a few thoughts about that, but first a word about AI. And you mentioned the SUI hacks earlier on. I think, to my opinion, a lot of what's happening is exactly what you were saying. That the cost of exploit has gone way down, and so it used to be that maybe you wouldn't exploit if there wasn't 10 or 50 or 100 million in TVL or some threshold, and that threshold has now gone way down because AI is what's uncovering the exploit and actually generating the exploit. It's uncovering the vulnerability, generating the exploit, and the attackers are able to do this with great throughput. And so it's suddenly a good business decision to exploit much smaller protocols that don't necessarily have as much security protection as some of the bigger guys. And I think that's exactly what we've seen on SUI. And so, at least from our perspective as a security provider, it's both we need to do a great job of auditing and all this, but also we have to use our own AI tools to try to get ahead of it. And that
Yep.
becomes incredibly important as a service we can provide to our customers. Just running and triaging AI tools, as fast as possible and keeping up with the latest advances in models is now part of the business, because otherwise an attacker is going to do that work for you. One, AI related, but actually general question, then we'll bring it back to AI, is about endpoint hardening. So I bring this up because endpoint hardening is in many ways outside the kind of distributed on your own laptop culture of Web3.
Yep.
Given that many teams are digital nomads and anti-surveillance, installing true enterprise MDM that locks down the system and monitors everything you do is often not a socially viable option for teams. But what's the right balance there in endpoint protection, and how do you at least make sure that you're not doing anything irresponsible?
It's a great question. I've worked at teams where they had to go through that same process of like slowly trying to bring more enterprise protections onto laptops, where a lot of developers, did not respond to it favorably. Um, I think the first thing is to recognize, like, okay, if you know, at the very least, you have to, if you can't assume that the endpoint is secure, then you have to put a lot more security in on, the ways that code is contributed. Like, I think using UB keys and GBT keys to like, sign every commit is a really strong one. So like, even if the device is compromised, UB keys generally can't be. That doesn't entirely protect against endpoint protection. There are still ways an attacker could get someone to blind sign something with a UB key, but you can at least add in additional layers of hardening there if your threat model just assumes we can't trust that user endpoints are secure. But that will introduce friction in other ways. So it's maybe the stick you can use to say it's going to be uncomfortable in some places, and the EMDM path might be better long term. And then on that, like, usually it's just to say, hey, at the end of the day, like, if you're a startup and you can afford to give your developers a laptop, then I think you can be a lot more stringent in saying, well, we understand that you have strong feelings about what happens on your laptop or your personal devices. This is a company laptop. At the end of the day, we paid for it. We own it. We decide what's on it. And I think taking a hard stance on at least that expectation, and while still having this acknowledgement of like, hey, we understand that productivity is important. We understand that if it's too locked down, you might find it frustrating to work or get things done. I think balancing that and saying, especially if you're rolling this out to a team that's not used to it, I've seen teams successfully say, hey, we're going to pick a couple people on the team and they're going to experience these new security updates first and make sure that it doesn't break their productivity. So if there isn't a problem that comes up, it can be addressed and made easier. So when it gets rolled out to the whole team, it's not as disruptive. I think just taking a phased approach and working with individuals that are supportive and able to kind of represent the team's interests when it comes to being productive is a very good way for teams to, I think, take it a lot better. And then, in terms of surveillance, just recognizing like, hey guys, we need to know what's going on. We need to know if you've been compromised. If there's something that you're not comfortable sharing, then it's probably something that shouldn't be on a company device. I know, like, traditionally people will use their company device as their personal device in a lot of cases, and they just have to recognize that it's a risk that the company could maybe see what they're doing on their company device, and company policies might also say that they don't want them doing certain things on their company device. And at the end of the day, you can always have a separate personal device for doing those things. I know if for people that are traveling, having to carry around a second laptop or second device is really annoying. But I do think that's like where we're getting to, and I think it is important. You could pitch it as work-life balance. At the end of the day, you work on your work laptop, you play video games or do whatever on your personal device. Maybe even dealing with personal crypto wallets on your personal device. But I do think this is something we need to get to. It is something where if I think any team that doesn't have EDR today that does anything sensitive is obviously in a very poor place. And then I guess the last one is there's often many debates about having dedicated devices for sensitive operations like signing. I personally do encourage it. I think if anyone is on sensitive multi-sigs or doing anything sensitive, they should at least consider having a dedicated device for that that's very locked down, like a Chromebook or something that's like very simple, very straightforward, only has the software on there needed to do the signing operations and nothing else. It's not always possible, but I know, but like, for example, we use air gap devices for certain things at Turnkey that are very sensitive. So I do think that's another path where, like, you should still, if you're a developer and you're doing anything involving code deployments, you should still be securing that device because there are so many ways it goes wrong. But if you're doing like multi-sig signing or something that, like, with a few wrong signatures could compromise millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, then it absolutely should be considered to have a dedicated device. And that would go a long way to reducing the attack surface to make it not impossible, but pretty hard for an attacker to compromise that device if you're only ever using it for a select few things. And those things, like just one comm channel, a few applications used for signing, etc., are all you do and nothing else. So it definitely requires more, I think, manual security practices. And then, at the end of the day, whatever you're doing, with endpoint devices, it's still really hard, even with a properly locked down device, to prevent someone from installing software that could compromise the system if they are, they just blow through the best practices and say, like, I'll click this email, I'll download this link. Yes, some endpoint detection devices could either stop it or catch it early, but it's never a guarantee. So I think it's still, like, the most important thing is, like, educating the people themselves, putting out phishing campaigns to, like, test and see how well your employees respond to things that could be malicious, is a good way, or reporting things that are clearly malicious so that other people are aware. Like, that's still probably the most, like, people are really good at compromising systems when they are foolish enough or committed enough to not following best practices to do so. Like, a person can find a hole. The CEO, for example, can always say, like, oh, override the MDM software. This is an investor that's really important. And it turns out that investor is just a DPRK fake or something like that. So the people are still going to be the biggest point of failure.
Absolutely. So maybe just to get around to my last question, but also share a story from one of the clients that I've worked with. The team started out as kind of fully into the decentralized model, and everybody's working everywhere on personal devices. And the first thing I pushed them to do was install EDR. And quickly we realized that EDR can see everything they browse on the internet. And initially we had central logging enabled. And the conversation came up, what do we do about adult sites? And it's just,
yep.
These are personal devices and people are browsing the internet. And the company's point of view was like, we we don't want to know. We need to stay out of people's business. And we kind of pulled back on the amount of centralized logging on the EDR. But as things progressed and as the protocol grew, they started getting more and more into leveraging Claude in particular, using AI and MCP on the endpoint device, and came back around fully to the idea that actually the endpoint can't be trusted at all. And so now it's become a clean device discussion. And I think ultimately, to me, and this kind of feeds into my last question, in the era of AI, where AI is such an important productivity tool, there has to be a set of sensitive operations that are done on AI free, air gapped, clean devices with MDM installed, fully locked down, because otherwise you end up trying to fence in and sandbox a technology that ultimately is not built to be sandboxed. And that would be Claude and all of its many extensions and plugins. And so I think the mature state to me is going to be that mix. But I'm curious your thoughts about the AI threat to the endpoint in particular. Now that everybody's connecting to Claude, and we know that prompt injection basically means some site on the internet that tells Claude to do something bad.
Yep.
How do you protect yourself in the era of AI? At least being responsible. We talked about air gap devices. What else can you do to be responsible as you let Claude into your life?
That's a great question, or a great point about AI and the fact that it's a blank check, system. I mean, there are times where let's avoid even discussing an attacker, and let's just say Claude itself can be its own risk if it decides to delete. If you give it access to your emails and it decides to delete them all, and you're telling it stop, and it's like, yeah, I know you told me to stop, but I'm not for whatever reason. We've had so many cases of files being deleted or Claude just wrecking stuff just when it goes rogue. And yeah, people are using Claude Cowork, or they're using other things where they're giving Claude more control over their end device, over their accounts, and it's absolutely its own risk category. And prompt injection and the way that attackers can leverage that is just kind of just adding fuel to the fire. So I actually agree with. I like that idea, and I think it's something that is a lot of security teams are still grappling with. Is in a world where you have Claude on devices and the productivity gains and the impact of Claude when it works 99% of the time is so enticing. Is it even worth trying to lock down an endpoint device when Claude could always be, or any AI tool could potentially be a point of compromise? And I actually agree. I think having totally separate devices where you just don't have any AI and everything else is very locked down is probably a good solution. Where when in doubt, when it gets too complex on one device, you split them out and you have things for dedicated purposes. I mean, we try to do the same thing with agentic wallets. That's something that's come up a lot with Turnkey, and we're often encouraging customers to be well, if you want this AI agent to trade on your behalf, give it a very scoped down API key. Don't just give it full access. Don't give it the wallet key pair itself. Give it an API key that can authorize signing, but only for maybe trading on this protocol. It can't withdraw money. It can't move it elsewhere. It can't do all these hallucinated things that would potentially damage you. And just always assume it could go rogue.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with that, and I think in general, it's going to be that. It's going to be the fact that social engineering is going to continue to be more sophisticated. It's going to continue to target people at these companies with, trying to build trust through, just more sophisticated means, playing the long game in some cases, in ways that are going to, I think really surprise people. Where you might be talking to someone for months. Another attack vector I've noticed is lots of BD people or kind of non-technical go-to-market people in crypto have been compromised recently on their Telegram, and then they'll use that to reach out to people saying, "Hey, it's me. You remember talking to me at this conference? Hey, I would love to show you something. Click on this link." And that's become its own attack vector. It's very unfortunate for teams. I even know someone at a security company who had their accounts compromised as a BD person, and that never looks good. But just knowing that anyone you interact with, their comms could be compromised, and you have to be super careful about what you click on. That anyone, even someone you would really trust otherwise, and having backup comms potentially to confirm or ask them something that ideally they should only know is useful. But that's just another point to say there's all these things that people have traditionally been able to trust, and maybe we knew it could be compromised, but it just wasn't that common or likely or felt far-fetched. And now it looks like a lot of these things are on the table for any protocol team that has any potential value at risk.
Yeah, and I would second that and just say that now the communication policy and how you conduct secure communications around sensitive operations becomes its own discipline that you need to build out. And it didn't exist before. You could trust
Yep.
that an email from someone was an email from that person and a Telegram message was. You can't. You really can't. And if you're executing signing or anything else sensitive based on a Telegram thread, you're making a giant mistake, and someone's going to find that and compromise you. It's just a matter of time. So we could probably go on for another hour, and I would enjoy that. But I think it's been 45 minutes. It's about time to turn it over to see if the audience has any questions for us. So why don't we open it up to questions? And if there are any questions or comments, we're happy to address them here. Otherwise, 45 minutes is always like the threshold of human attention span. Good time for us to wrap up. So please feel free to put questions into the chat, and we'll be glad to address them. So while we're waiting to see anything come in here, I guess my final question to you, Michael, is how much have you let Claude into your life?
That's a good question. I've used it quite a bit. I would say I use the web portal version. I've experimented with the idea of like using like an open claw or like hook up to like different accounts, but I've found a mix of it's just not as impactful as I would like in some cases, in the sense that like if it's going to draft a tweet for me, I almost want to review the tweet anyway. So like the effort of copy pasting it in, or the effort of like using it in ways that were like I kind of prefer the manual touch in every way. So if I'm going to use it to draft something, or do anything that involves interacting with something sensitive, or communicating with someone on my behalf as me, like I would rather be in the mix to like still feel like I actually own the action or the communication or whatever. I did play around with OpenCloud. I like the like way it could build context through Markdown, but I also found it very stupid at times. I found there was one time where I asked it to like install an API key just to like be able to read stuff from the internet, and I was like, "Can you install it into your own config file?" And it was like, "Sure," and then it lobotomized itself and it didn't work anymore. So um, I think what Claude is doing in terms of like kind of building in some of those capabilities into itself through cowork are really cool, but I do feel like it's just not something I feel like I can casually hook up. I feel like if I'm going to hook it up to something sensitive, I really need to put a lot of thought into it. So I've let it in a decent amount. I rely on it a good amount nowadays to be able to like just do research and draft up things. And of course, I use Claude Code quite a bit, but usually also the web version where it's like deploying this directly to a repo where I can review it. I've run it on my device a bit, but I've always been like a little bit scared of like letting it like run commands on my device and the implications of that. I'm also like kind of it runs faster if you're using either Codex or Claude Code to just do it in the web browser without having to be prompted every time to say, "Can I run this command or this command?" Um, so yeah, in general, I have let it in, but I try to I keep it a pretty good distance between anything I care about, um, just in case.
Yeah, I think you and I are on the same wavelength there. I use Claude all the time, but I have yet to cross the gap of just letting Claude take control of my desktop and do whatever it wants. And I'm not sure that I'm ready to cross that anytime soon.
Yep.
So looks like the audience is satisfied with what we've done thus far and happy without asking any additional questions. That must be because we were so incredibly thorough, specific, and concise that nobody has anything more to ask. So good time for us to wrap up. Thank you, Michael. I thought it was a great discussion. I appreciate you joining us today and hope we get to do this again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me, Seth. It was a great time, and yeah, hope you have a good one, and so does everyone else.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Take care.